The Apache woman I rescued was right on top of me when I woke up. The reason she gave me left me speechless. Before we get into the story, don't forget to like the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Late autumn had brought a deep cold to the land, the kind that stiffened a man's hands, even inside leather gloves, and made every breath sting. Michael Boone rode slowly along the creek, reins loose in his hand, shoulders hunched against the wind. He'd gone out that evening to check the small traps he had set for rabbits. Nothing fancy, just wire and bait tucked under brush. Trapping wasn't his main thing. He was a cattle hand by trade, but with the herd thinned out for the season and not much reason to head into town, the traps helped fill out his pantry. Flour and beans don't last forever. Michael was 37. His face was weathered, etched with years of sun and wind, a scar running from his left cheekbone down toward his jaw, one of many reminders of his years in the cavalry. He'd buried his wife 6 years earlier, her body giving out during childbirth, the baby gone with her. Since then, he'd lived alone in his small cabin built from cut pine, his days a cycle of routine: water, wood, fence lines, stock, and silence. It was that silence that kept him going, even though it weighed on him as much as it steadied him. That night, he almost missed her. At first, he thought it was just some brush caught in the current, a shape huddled against the edge of the creek where the mud was dark. His horse snorted and stamped, drawing his eye back. Michael pulled the reins and leaned forward in the saddle, narrowing his gaze. It wasn't brush. The figure was human, small, slumped, the outline of a dress clinging to the body. He dismounted quickly, boots sinking into the half-frozen mud. His heart kicked hard, not in fear, but in recognition of trouble. People didn't end up like this without something bad happening to them. He crouched, the wind cutting across his face, and saw her more clearly. A young woman, maybe in her 20s, skin bronze in the dim light, hair long and black, tangled with dirt and twigs. Her dress was deerskin, worn thin, torn across the seams at her chest and ribs, leaving skin exposed to the cold. Her lips were cracked, her body shivering, her feet bare and raw. Michael's first thought was that she might already be gone. He pressed a hand against her shoulder and felt warmth, weak, but there. She stirred faintly, her breath shallow, her eyelids flickering, though she never opened them. His hand came away wet, blood from a gash down her arm, clotted in places, but still open. He let out a slow breath, weighing what this meant. An Apache woman, alone, hurt, half dead by the creek. He knew the risks. Bringing her to his cabin could cause trouble. Settlers who hated her people who might think he had harmed her. But leaving her there meant certain death. He stood there in the wind, his boots planted, his jaw tight. For a moment, the old war voice in his head told him to walk away, to keep his life simple. But he remembered another night, 6 years past, holding his wife's hand as it went limp. He couldn't stomach leaving another to die alone. Michael slid his arms under her and lifted her. She was heavier than she looked, her body solid, though starved, her head rolling against his chest. He felt the line of her ribs, the weight of her curves pressing into him through the torn dress. He set her across the saddle, tying her steady with a lead rope. His horse shifted, uneasy, but held still as he swung up behind her. He kept one arm firm around her as he nudged the horse forward, the creek fading behind them. The ride back stretched long. The cold cut through his coat, and he worried about how little warmth she had left. He glanced down more than once, checking the rise and fall of her chest. Each time he saw it move, relief settled, though it never lasted. She moaned once, a broken sound, and his arm tightened around her to keep her upright. By the time they reached the cabin, night had deepened. The small structure sat at the edge of the timberline, rough-hewn logs chinked with mud, smoke still faint from the fire he had banked earlier. He pulled the horse up hard, swung down, and carried her inside. The cabin was plain, one bed against the back wall, a stove near the center, shelves lined with tin and sacks. He laid her on the bed, the wool quilt rough but warmer than the night air. Up close, her condition was worse than he thought. The cut on her arm was deep, the edges jagged as if made by stone or blade. Her dress was torn so badly across the bodice that half her chest was exposed, the fabric stretched and split. He forced himself to look past it, focusing on the wound, the trembling, the shallow breaths. Michael dug for his tin of clean rags, poured water into a bowl, and began cleaning the blood. She jerked weakly when the cold water hit her skin, a small gasp escaping her lips. He pressed firmly until the bleeding slowed, then tore strips from an old shirt and wrapped her arm tight. He tucked the quilt around her shoulders, pulling it high to cover what the dress could not. He stood over her for a long moment, breathing heavily, his mind working fast. Who was she? Why was she alone? Was someone hunting her? The questions pressed hard, but answers would come later. Right now, she needed to live through the night. Michael stoked the fire high, throwing on split logs until the cabin filled with orange light. He dragged the chair close to the stove, sat with his rifle leaning against the table, and kept his eyes on her. His body ached from the ride, but he didn't let himself relax. He listened to the wind pressing against the walls, the crackle of the fire, and her faint breathing under the quilt. Every few minutes he looked to her chest, waiting for the rise and fall. He thought of his wife again, the helplessness, the way her hand had gone slack, no matter how tight he held it. The memory burned behind his eyes, but he kept it down. This time he told himself he wouldn't just sit by. He had made a choice, and he would see it through. The night stretched slowly. Hours passed, his eyes burning but open, his jaw clenched against fatigue. The woman shifted once, murmuring words he couldn't catch, then stilled again. He didn't move toward her, didn't try to rouse her. He only sat watchful, his hands steady on the rifle across his knees. By dawn, Michael Boone hadn't slept a single minute. The Apache woman was still alive, her breaths weak, but even. He stayed in his chair, the fire burning strong, and the cabin no longer felt empty, though the weight of what came next pressed down on him heavier than the night before. The first light of morning seeped through the narrow window panes, faint and grey, cutting through the smoke that still lingered from the stove. Michael Boone stirred in the chair, his back stiff from hours of sitting upright. He hadn't slept. The rifle still rested against the table within reach, his boots still on, his coat draped loosely over his shoulders. His eyes hadn't left the figure on the bed for long stretches through the night. Though every time he feared he'd find her gone, her chest continued to rise and fall in a shallow but steady rhythm. Now, as the light thickened, he saw movement. The quilt shifted, slowly at first, then with sudden urgency. Michael pushed up from the chair, his pulse kicking. The Apache woman's head turned against the pillow, her dark hair spilling across her face. Then, without warning, she pushed herself upright and onto him. He barely had time to react before she straddled him, her knees pressing into the mattress on either side of his waist, her palms planted hard against his chest. Michael froze, his hands half raised, not out of fear for his safety, but out of shock at the suddenness of it. Her hair hung loose, shadowing her face, her breathing quick and uneven. The blanket had slipped from her shoulders, leaving only the torn deerskin dress to cover her. The fabric pulled tight and gaping across her chest, the split seams exposing skin that should have been hidden. For a moment, the war-trained instinct to shove her off flickered, but he forced it down. She was trembling, not from cold alone, but from fear. Her voice came low, strained, halting English. "If you put me outside, I die." The words hit him harder than her weight. He realized then what this was. Not an attack, not seduction, but desperation. She thought her only chance of safety lay in offering herself, in making sure he had a reason to keep her close. Michael swallowed, his chest tight. He set his hands gently on her forearms, steady but firm. His voice came out rough, sleep-starved. "I don't put people out." She searched his face, her dark eyes sharp, almost unbelieving. He held her gaze until the tension in her shoulders slackened, and she sagged forward, resting against him. He could feel her ribs press against his chest beneath the thin fabric, could feel her shivering ease just a little. For a long while he didn't move, only let her stay there. His mind turned over what had been left unsaid the night before, questions that gnawed at him. Who was she running from? Why had she been alone by the creek, half frozen and bleeding? Had someone tried to kill her? Or had her own people cast her out? Those questions hung heavy, but he kept them silent. Words could wait. Survival could not. Michael eased her back onto the bed, pulling the quilt up firmly this time, tucking it around her shoulders so she was covered. She didn't fight him, didn't look away either. When she finally closed her eyes, he stepped back, exhaling through his nose, the knot in his chest pulling tight. He busied himself with the stove, scraping out the ashes, throwing in fresh wood. The fire crackled, light pushing against the dim corners of the cabin. He set water to boil, spooned coffee grounds into the pot. He thought of what else she would need. Food, a stronger bandage for her arm, clothes, since hers were barely holding on. He glanced at the half-built shelves against the wall where he kept spare shirts and trousers. Rough work clothes that would hang loose on her but serve better than the rags she wore. When he turned back, she was watching him. Her eyes followed his every movement. He realized then that she was measuring him, testing if his words about not putting her out were real. Michael sat on the edge of the chair again, resting his forearms on his knees. He kept his tone even, serious. "You're safe here. No one's going to touch you." The words came harder than he expected, heavy in his throat, because saying them meant a choice. If someone was after her, they'd eventually come to his door, and he'd be standing between them. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. When the coffee was ready, he poured her a cup and set it on the small table beside the bed. He tore bread from a stale loaf, placed it with a strip of dried venison on a tin plate. She hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for it. He watched her chew slowly, her jaw tight, as though she expected him to snatch the food away. He let her eat in silence, his own cup warming his hands. The quiet stretched long. Michael's thoughts circled back to what the folks in town would say if they knew. A white man alone in a cabin with an Apache woman. It would stir talk, and talk could turn to trouble. He had no fondness for the town anyway. He went only when necessary: flour, salt, nails. He kept to himself, and they left him alone, more out of indifference than respect. If they saw her, it would change. But as he looked at her wrapped in his quilt, fragile yet unbroken, he knew he wouldn't send her back into the cold. He didn't know what tomorrow brought, or who might come looking, but he'd already decided. She would stay until she could walk on her own, until she chose otherwise. The woman set the empty tin back on the table. She said nothing, only pulled the quilt tighter, her dark eyes fixed on him. Michael felt the weight of the silence press down between them, heavier than any words. He leaned back in the chair, the rifle within reach, and thought of how this night had changed everything. He'd gone out only to check traps. Instead, he'd brought home someone who might drag the past to his door, or give him a reason to start living again. As the morning wore on, he rose and went outside to haul water from the creek. The air was sharp, the ground frozen solid. He moved quickly, uneasy about leaving her alone in the cabin, even for a few minutes. When he returned, she was still there, still under the quilt, her gaze following him as he set the buckets down. Something in her look had shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the faintest recognition that he had kept his word. The day stretched forward, uncertain. Michael had no answers for who she was, what had driven her to collapse by the creek, or whether danger would follow. But the first decision had been made. She was alive inside his cabin, and he would see that she stayed that way. That was enough for now. The day after she first woke in his cabin, Michael Boone rose early. He'd only slept in short bursts, his body trained to stay half alert, the way it had been in the cavalry. Dawn filtered through the small window, lighting the rough interior of the cabin. The wooden shelves stacked with tins and sacks, the rifle leaning near the door, the one bed with the Apache woman still curled beneath the quilt. She was watching him again, her dark eyes steady, as though she still expected him to vanish or push her out into the cold the moment his patience thinned. Michael pulled on his coat, stepped outside, and split wood until the sweat under his shirt turned cold against his skin. His thoughts pressed hard while the axe bit into the logs. Who was she, really? He had carried her home half dead, but now she had eaten. She had strength in her stare. She had said almost nothing beyond that first desperate plea. The questions circled. Was she running from settlers, from her own people, or from men who had harmed her in the town of Grey Bluff? Whispers about Apache raids and stolen cattle were common. If word spread, he was sheltering a young Apache woman. Suspicion could turn sharp. He told himself the questions didn't matter yet. What mattered was that she was alive and under his roof. When he stepped back inside, the fire had burned low. She had moved from the bed, standing barefoot near the stove, wrapped still in the quilt. She jumped slightly when the door closed behind him, then straightened, her chin lifting in quiet defiance. For the first time, Michael saw a flicker of pride, not just fear. "You shouldn't stand long," he said, setting the fresh split logs beside the stove. "Your arm needs time." She didn't answer right away. Her eyes fell on the bandage he had tied the night before. Her fingers touched it lightly, testing the wrap. Then, in careful English, she said, "I can work. I'm not useless." The words surprised him. Michael poured water from the bucket into the kettle, set it on the stove, and leaned against the table. He measured his response, aware that every word might decide whether she trusted him or not. "We'll come to that soon enough. First, you heal." Her eyes narrowed, as if she thought he was mocking her. Then she wrapped the quilt tighter and sat back on the bed, without another word. Michael watched her, noticing things he had missed in the chaos of the night before. The bruises faint along her thigh, where the torn dress split, the red scrapes on her knees, the way her shoulders seemed too tense for someone only recovering from the cold. Those marks weren't from falling at the creek. Someone had chased her hard before she reached it. After breakfast, which was nothing more than beans left simmering from the night before, Michael started talking about the day's chores. The woman followed him with her eyes, silent. But when he stepped toward the door with the buckets, she rose and said, "I come." Her English was blunt, the words clipped but clear. He studied her posture, bare feet, injured arm, body still weak. She was determined. Against his first instinct to refuse, he nodded once. They stepped out into the sharp air. Frost clung to the ground, the creek's edge brittle with ice. Michael filled one bucket, then handed her the smaller one. She winced, but held it steady, carrying it back toward the cabin with careful steps. The quilt trailed behind her, wrapped awkwardly over her torn dress. She didn't stumble, didn't complain. Inside, when they set the water down, she looked at him and said, "I help more." Michael considered. He saw the questions that listeners might ask. Why would a woman in her state insist on working instead of resting? The answer was clear enough in her eyes. She feared being cast off again. She thought if she proved useful, he would keep her. He pulled a small pile of kindling toward her and said, "Stack this by the stove. Only small pieces. Don't strain your arm." She nodded, kneeling on the floor, fingers moving carefully as she arranged the wood. Michael watched her for a moment, before turning to mend a section of the saddle strap that had split. The quiet in the cabin wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the sound of her moving the kindling, the occasional crackle of the fire, his knife scraping leather. It felt like a fragile routine was taking shape. When midday came, he cooked again, this time coffee, beans, and a strip of salted pork. He handed her a plate, and she ate slowly, eyes fixed on the food as though every bite had to be measured. Michael asked, "What's your name?" She froze, spoon halfway to her mouth. A long silence stretched, her gaze locked on him. Finally she said, "Nia." The sound of it was soft, certain, the first thing she had offered freely since she woke. Michael repeated it quietly, almost to himself. "Nia." He nodded once, letting it settle. She looked at him then, a flicker of surprise crossing her face, as though she hadn't expected him to treat the name with weight. The day went on with small labors. He checked the fence line near the cabin while she watched from the porch, wrapped in the quilt, but standing tall. She scanned the tree line often, her sharp eyes flicking at every noise. Michael noticed it, how she tensed at the caw of a crow or the snap of a branch. She wasn't just afraid of being abandoned, she was afraid of being found. That night, when the fire was high and the wind howled against the walls, Michael sat by the stove cleaning his rifle. Nia sat across from him, legs tucked beneath the quilt. She broke the silence first, her English slow but pointed. You were soldier." Michael's hands paused on the cloth he used to oil the barrel. He didn't answer right away. Finally he said, "Yes, cavalry." She nodded as if a piece of a puzzle fit. "That why you carry me?" Her words struck him deeper than he expected. She wasn't wrong. The training had taught him discipline. But it wasn't the soldier in him that had carried her. It was the man who had failed to save his wife. He didn't explain that. He only said, "I carried you because you needed it." Nia's gaze held his, long and searching, before she lowered it and pulled the quilt tighter. As the night drew longer, Michael felt the edges of something change in the cabin. The questions that had hung since the first night, who she was, why she had been left at the creek, whether she would survive, had shifted into something more immediate. She was alive. Her name was Nia, and she had chosen to stay under his roof another day. The rest could come later. When he banked the fire and leaned back in his chair, rifle near, he caught her watching him once more. This time there was no fear in her eyes, only exhaustion and the smallest trace of something else. Relief. Michael turned his gaze to the flames. For the first time in years, the silence in the cabin didn't feel like a burden he had to carry alone. The following morning came grey and biting, the kind of morning when frost clung stubbornly to the ground and the creek's surface cracked under the smallest touch. Michael rose early as usual, pulling on his boots with the heavy, practiced rhythm of a man who had lived alone too long. His first glance went to the bed. Nia was awake, already sitting upright, the quilt wrapped around her shoulders. She didn't flinch at his movement this time. Instead, she simply watched him, her face calm but guarded, her long hair loose and dark against the rough fabric. Michael noted the difference. The first nights had been full of tension and fear, her body ready to bolt, her eyes sharp as if expecting a blow. Now, though she was still weary, she didn't look like she would run. That shift mattered, and Michael didn't let it go unmarked. "Cold day," he muttered, pulling his coat around his shoulders. His voice was gruff, half from habit and half from sleep still clinging to him. "We'll need more wood if this weather keeps up." Nia tilted her head. "I help." He studied her. Her arm was still bandaged, but her color had returned a little. She had eaten more the day before, even spoken her name aloud. He knew listeners would wonder, why let her strain herself now when she was still healing? Why not insist she stay in bed? Michael's thought was plain. If he treated her like a prisoner of her own weakness, she would never trust him. Letting her take part was the only way she'd believe she belonged here, at least for now. "You carry what you can, not more," he said. She nodded, a flicker of determination in her eyes. They stepped outside. The air was sharp, cutting into their lungs, but the sky had cleared, a pale blue expanse stretching above the frost-covered ground. Michael guided her to the small pile of cut logs near the shed. He demonstrated how to separate the kindling, how to organize the thicker pieces by size. At first her movements were awkward, hampered by the bandaged arm, but she didn't complain. She bit down on her breath and persevered, her hair falling across her face as she bent to lift smaller pieces. Michael worked alongside her, splitting a fresh round of logs with the axe, the sharp sound echoing through the trees. He found himself glancing at her more often than he intended. The torn seams of her dress, now partially concealed beneath the quilt, still revealed glimpses of skin when she leaned over. Her figure was curvy and strong, a fact that became even more apparent when she stretched to lift a heavier piece of wood. He quickly averted his gaze, focusing on his work. but the image lingered in his mind nonetheless. Desires stirred within him, but he consciously suppressed them. She needed security above all else, and that meant he had to keep his feelings in check. By midday, they carried the wood inside and built a roaring fire. Nia's cheeks were flushed from the cold, and her chest rose and fell with exertion. She sat on the floor near the stove, resting her arm in her lap, and Michael poured her a tin cup of water. She accepted it, offering a single nod of thanks. The silence stretched on until she asked, "Why do you live alone?" Michael tensed. It was the first direct question she had posed about him. He pondered for a long moment, staring into the fire before responding, "My wife's gone. Been gone 6 years. She died giving birth to our child. Lost them both." Nia's eyes lowered. She remained silent for a moment, her fingers tightening around the cup. Then she inquired, "No family here?" "No." His voice was flat and heavy. "I served in the cavalry before this. Spent years riding, fighting, doing things I'd rather forget. When I came back, I built this cabin. Haven't left much since." Nia absorbed his words. Michael could see it in the way she sized him up, the way her eyes softened slightly. Anyone listening might have wondered why he had chosen to take her in, considering the potential danger it could bring. The answer lay in his past. He had already lost everything that once anchored him. Carrying her from the creek hadn't been solely out of a sense of duty. It had been a refusal to allow another life to slip away when he still had the ability to intervene. Later that afternoon, Michael took her to the fence line. The rails had sagged due to the wind from the previous week. One post was tilting, loosened from the earth. He handed her a short-handled hammer and gestured. "We'll set it back straight. You hold. I drive." She crouched low, her bare feet pressing into the frost, holding the rail steady while he swung the mallet. The post thudded deeper with each blow. Her face tightened when the wood jarred against her injured arm, but she didn't release her grip. Michael noticed the tremor in her shoulders. He stopped, set the mallet aside, and crouched beside her. "Enough," he said. "You'll tear the wound open." Her jaw tightened. "I can." He met her gaze, seeing the pride burning there. Then, in a softer tone, he said, "You don't need to prove anything. You're here. That's enough." The words seemed to disarm her. She looked away, breathing heavily, then slowly released the rail. Michael guided her back toward the cabin, his hands steady at her elbow. That night, the routine was the same. Beans simmering in the pot, coffee brewing, the wind pressing against the walls. But something had shifted. Nia sat on the edge of the bed, wrapped in a shirt now instead of the torn dress, the quilt draped across her lap. She had found it folded in the trunk when he stepped out to the shed. The sight of her in his clothes struck Michael harder than he had anticipated. His shirt hung loose on her, slipping at the collar, revealing the curve of her neck and chest. But she wore it with a natural grace. As they ate, she asked quietly, "If men come here, what will you do?" Michael set his spoon down, meeting her gaze. "Depends on who they are. If they come to harm you, they'll have to get through me first." Her lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't expected that answer. She nodded once slowly and resumed eating. When the plates were empty, she pulled the quilt closer and lay back on the bed. Michael sat in his chair by the fire, cleaning his rifle. His thoughts replayed everything that had happened since he had found her. He had questions, too many of them, but he wouldn't force them. Trust was built in silence as much as in words. As the firelight flickered across the room, Nia spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "My people, they don't want me back." Michael looked at her, but she closed her eyes, turning her face toward the wall. He didn't press her. He simply sat there steadily, his rifle in hand, the fire hissing softly. Outside, the night stretched endlessly. Inside, the silence between them was no longer filled with fear. It held the beginning of something else. Not comfort, not yet, but the fragile start of belonging. The days settled into a rhythm neither of them had foreseen. By the 5th morning since Michael had carried her from the creek, the air outside had turned harsher, with snow looming in the heavy grey sky. It was the kind of weather that made a man assess every remaining chore. Michael put on his coat, filled the stove with fresh wood, and then glanced toward the bed. Nia was already awake, sitting upright in his shirt, the quilt wrapped around her legs. Colour had returned to her cheeks, a change that eased something inside him. He realized that questions still lingered, questions that any man or anyone listening would demand to know. Where had she come from? Why had she been left in that condition, alone and bleeding? He hadn't pushed her before because her strength was too fragile. But now, watching her gather the quilt around her shoulders and rise steadily to her feet, he knew the time had come. "You said your people don't want you back," Michael said quietly as he poured water into a pot for coffee. His back was to her, but he could hear the slight shift of her weight on the floorboards. "Why?" There was a pause, long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then her voice came, low but clear. "I spoke against men who brought harm to women. They said I dishonored the chief. I was cast out." Michael turned then, meeting her eyes. The words were simple, but they carried a heavy weight. He could see the pride in her face, the stubbornness of someone who had chosen not to yield, even when it cost her everything. He understood that kind of loss. He didn't press further, only offered a short nod. "Then you're here now," he said, "and here no one casts you out." For a moment her eyes softened, but she quickly looked away, busying herself with folding the quilt. By midday the chores were pressing. The fence needed checking again, and the sky promised snow by nightfall. Michael saddled his horse, led it to the yard, and found Nia already standing by the gate, wrapped in his coat this time. She had tied the sleeves back to fit her smaller frame. Her hair whipped across her face in the wind, but she stood firm. "You don't need to come," Michael said. "I come," she replied without hesitation. He weighed the risk. Her wound was still tender, and her body was still recovering. But the stubborn look in her eyes left no room for argument, so he nodded once, and together they walked the line of rails stretching toward the timber. The work was hard. Michael hauled the heavy mallet, showing her where the post had loosened. She pressed her shoulder against the rail while he drove it deeper. Her strength surprised him. Her curves and soft lines concealed muscle and grit. She bit down on pain when the effort pulled at her bandaged arm, but she didn't let go. When the rail finally set tight, she stepped back, her breath steaming, her face streaked with dirt. Michael studied her a moment too long, his gaze caught by the loose fit of his coat on her frame, the glimpse of her leg where it parted at her thigh. He dragged his eyes away, muttering, "Good work." That evening, snow began to fall. Flakes drifted down in a thick silence, dusting the cabin roof, coating the yard in white. Inside, the fire blazed high, beans simmering in the pot. Michael sat at the table, Nia across from him, her dark hair damp from melted flakes she had brushed away. When she reached for her cup, the sleeve of his shirt slipped back, revealing the line of her wrist and the strong curve of her forearm. Her eyes met his then, steady and waiting. Something passed between them, wordless but intense. Michael's chest tightened. He had spent years suppressing any thought of intimacy, walling himself off after the burial under the cottonwood tree where his wife lay. But now, across from him, sat a woman who had chosen to stay in his cabin, who worked beside him, who had looked him in the eye when she said her name. He leaned back in his chair, forcing his voice to remain even. "You're healing. That's what matters first." Her lips curved faintly, not quite a smile, but close. And afterward the question hung heavy, and he didn't know what lay beyond these walls. He only knew that she wasn't leaving tomorrow, or the day after. He met her gaze, his answer clear. Then the firelight flickered across her face, softening the hard lines of weariness. For the first time, she looked at ease. She finished her food slowly, then drew the quilt tighter and stretched out on the bed. Michael remained in his chair, but his thoughts churned. He knew that anyone listening to this story would wonder if he feared what was coming, whether her people would come, whether townspeople would discover her here. The truth was, yes, he feared it. But fear no longer outweighed the fact that she was alive in his cabin, and he had given her his word that she would not be cast out. Before banking the fire, Michael glanced once more at her. Nia's eyes were closed, her breathing steady, her body curled into the quilt. She looked nothing like the half-dead figure he had lifted from the creek. He stood there for a long moment, his rifle leaning by his side, and admitted silently that his life had shifted. The snow thickened outside, muffling every sound. Inside, for the first time in years, Michael felt the cabin wasn't just a shelter for one man. It was beginning to feel like a place where two could endure. The storm held through the night and into the next day, burying the land under a hard crust of snow. Michael rose at first light, the cold biting deeper than before. He had slept little, his ears attuned to every creak of the timbers, every gust that rattled against the shutters. Years of soldiering had left him with the habit of half-sleep, and the presence of another soul under his roof had sharpened his senses even more. Nia was still asleep when he moved from his chair. She lay curled in the quilt, his shirt slipping off one shoulder, her dark hair spread across the pillow. Her face in repose carried none of the guarded hardness she wore when awake. For a moment he stood still, struck by how quickly his cabin had changed from silence to something else. He added wood to the fire, stoking it until warmth pushed back against the icy draught. When he turned again, her eyes were open, watching him. She pulled the quilt higher, but she did not look away. "You work always," she said, her voice low, her English careful. "Work keeps this place standing," he replied, pouring water into the kettle. "Without it, cold gets in, fence falls, stock wanders off." She studied him, then asked, "No one help you before me?" Michael paused. He knew that listeners might have wondered the same thing. How long had he been alone? And why had no one come to ease his burden? He set the kettle on the stove and answered plainly, "I kept to myself. Folks in town don't ask questions, and I don't offer answers. It was easier that way." Nia tilted her head. Easier, but not better. The words struck harder than he had expected. He didn't reply, only busied himself with making coffee. Later, when the storm eased enough to clear the air, Michael took his rifle and stepped outside to check the yard. The snow reached his boots, crunching beneath him. As he circled the cabin, he noticed something that stiffened his spine. Tracks, not from deer or coyote, but men. Faint, half-filled with new snow, leading toward the creek and back again. He crouched low, brushing snow away to study the prints. Square-toed boots. At least 2 men, maybe more. He returned inside, his jaw tight. Nia looked up from where she sat by the fire, sewing one of his old shirts with clumsy but determined stitches. She sensed the tension in him immediately. "What is it?" she asked. "Tracks," Michael said, leaning the rifle against the wall. "Men have been close. Not last night, but before the snow covered them." Her face tightened, her fingers stilled on the cloth, and he knew what she was thinking. That whoever had chased her before might have followed her. He sat across from her, studying her face. "If they come, they'll have to get through me first." Nia studied him, fear flickering in her eyes, but also something else, something that looked like trust. The day dragged on under that shadow. Michael worked with her close by, never straying far from his rifle. He showed her how to feed the fire properly, how to clean beans before cooking, how to stretch salt pork into stew. She watched carefully, repeating each task with quiet determination. She wanted to prove herself, but more than that, she wanted to know how to belong in this cabin. By evening, the snow pressed thick against the windows. Michael closed the shutters, locked the door, and stoked the stove high. The cabin filled with heat that flushed his skin. He shed his coat, rolling up his sleeves, while Nia sat across from him, the quilt falling from her shoulders. She wore only his shirt now, the hem brushing her thighs, the collar hanging loose, her curves pressed against the fabric, her chest rising and falling in the flickering light. Michael felt the weight of it in his chest. He tried to focus on his hands, on the work of oiling the rifle, but his eyes drifted back to her. She caught him looking and did not turn away. "You saved me," she said quietly. "Why?" The question had hung unsaid since the first night, and Michael knew that anyone listening would want to hear the truth. He set the rifle down slowly, leaning forward with his forearms on his knees. "Because I couldn't watch you die. I've seen too much of that already. My wife, my child, men I rode with in the cavalry. I couldn't let another life slip away if I had the strength to stop it." Nia's eyes softened, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. Instead, she stood slowly and crossed the room. The fire cast her in a warm light as she stopped before him. She placed her hand on his chest, steady but trembling. Michael's breath caught. He had denied himself closeness for years, burying every instinct beneath work and silence. Now, with her standing there, her eyes locked on his, the choice pressed sharp and heavy. He covered her hand with his own, his rough fingers steadying her. "I won't put you out," he said, his voice low. "Not tomorrow. Not ever." Her face shifted then, a mix of relief and something deeper. She leaned closer, her hair brushing against his cheek. For a long moment, the silence carried everything that words could not. Then, slowly, Michael closed the distance, pressing his lips to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, the taste of fire, smoke and warmth passing between them. But when she pressed back, it deepened, growing steady and real. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his chest. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her without hunger, without demand, only with the certainty that she was safe. The storm raged outside, the wind howling against the timbers. But inside the cabin, the bond between them had shifted. What had begun as survival had turned into something more, something fragile but unbreakable. Michael knew that there were still questions unanswered about the men who had left those tracks, about whether danger would come to his door. But for now, the only thing that mattered was that Nia had chosen to stay close, and he had chosen not to let her go. The storm passed by the next morning, leaving the ground buried under a clean, sharp crust of white. Smoke curled from the cabin's chimney into a sky clear and blue. But the silence outside was uneasy. Michael Boone stepped into the yard with his rifle slung, his breath showing in the air, his boots sinking into the frozen snow. Nia stood at the doorway, wrapped in his coat, watching him scan the tree line. The memory of the tracks he'd found still burned sharply in his mind. Men had been close, closer than he liked, and the snow had only partially obscured the trail. Somewhere out there, someone knew she was alive. Michael crouched by the fence rail, brushing snow from the wood. He had spent years living quietly, keeping to himself, and trouble rarely touched his cabin. Now it had found its way to his doorstep. He thought of what listeners would ask. Who were those men, and what did they want? He knew the answer, even if he hadn't said it aloud. Whoever had chased Nia before wouldn't let her go easily, cast out or not. A young Apache woman wandering alone was prey to raiders, drifters, and men who thrived on cruelty. Inside the cabin, Nia busied herself with mending the torn seams of the deerskin dress she had been wearing when he found her. Her stitches were uneven, the thread thick, but her hands moved steadily. She had refused to remain idle since the night she had revealed why she had been cast out, and Michael recognized the weight behind her need to work. It wasn't just about survival, it was about pride. She had to prove that she was not a burden. When he came back in, brushing snow from his shoulders, she looked up quickly, her eyes sharp. "More tracks?" she asked. Michael shook his head. "Not fresh, but the ones I saw yesterday were real." Someone came close. Her lips pressed thin, her jaw tightening. For a moment, she looked as though she might break, but then her gaze steadied. "They will come again." Michael studied her. "You think they're looking for you?" She nodded once. "I ran from men who trade women. They hunt me." The words fell heavily between them, filling in a blank that had hung since the first chapter of her story. Michael understood then why she had clung to him that first morning, why fear had driven her to straddle him in desperation. She hadn't been running from hunger alone. She had been running from men who had decided that her worth was no more than what they could sell. His chest tightened, anger rising beneath his ribs. He had seen enough of that in the war, men using power to strip dignity from others. He had no patience for it here. "If they come," he said, his voice flat, "they'll have to get through me." The rest of the day passed under that shadow. Michael worked on strengthening the cabin, hauling more wood inside, checking the latch on the shutters. He laid out extra ammunition on the table, cleaned his rifle with sharp precision. Nia watched him, her face unreadable, but he could see the questions in her eyes. Why risk himself for her, a stranger, when he could turn her away and be left in peace. He didn't answer aloud, but the truth sat heavily in his chest. He had already made his choice when he carried her from the creek. Peace without her wasn't worth the silence anymore. That night, the unease grew. The wind had calmed, but Michael slept lightly, his hand never far from the rifle propped by the bed. Naya lay close, her body curled under the quilt, her breathing steady. Sometime after midnight, the dogs in the valley barked, distant but sharp. Michael sat upright instantly, listening. Naya stirred, her hand gripping his arm. "What is it?" she whispered. "Men, maybe," he muttered, straining to hear past the windless dark. The barking faded, replaced by silence again. He remained awake long after, watching the window until the first edge of dawn returned. By morning, the tension had not left him. He moved through the cabin with sharper movements, his jaw tight, his silence heavier. Nia felt it too. She rose, pulling his shirt around her frame, and helped prepare food, though her fingers trembled. When she set the plate before him, she finally asked, "If they come, will you send me away so they leave you?" Michael stopped with his fork halfway to his mouth. His eyes met hers across the table. He didn't look away, not once. "No, I told you, you're here now. That means you stay." Her lips parted, and for the first time he saw tears well up in her eyes, though they didn't fall. She swallowed hard, nodding. "Then I fight too." He let the silence sit for a long moment, then nodded back. "If it comes to it, we both fight." That evening, as snow began to fall again, Nia sat beside the fire, combing through her hair with her fingers. Michael sat opposite her, his rifle laid across his knees, his eyes fixed on the flames, but his mind elsewhere. The cabin had always been his refuge, built plank by plank after the war, meant to keep the world at bay. Now, with her inside, it had become something more. It was no longer just a shelter. It was a line drawn, a stand made. And he knew one thing clearly. If trouble came knocking, he was ready to meet it, because letting Nia go back into the cold was no longer an option he could live with. That night, she moved closer before the fire burned low. She rested her hand on his shoulder, then leaned against him, her warmth pressing into his side. He didn't shift away. He laid his arm around her shoulders, steady and protective, and let the silence close around them. The questions, the danger, the men who might come, all of it waited outside the cabin walls. For now, what mattered was simple. She was there, and he was not alone. By the next morning, the valley lay still beneath a hard crust of snow. Sunlight broke across the timber line, sharply contrasting against the pristine white canvas of the snow-covered ground. Michael Boone's lingering unease refused to dissipate. He stirred before dawn, his movements deliberate and somewhat stiff as he tugged on his worn boots and heavy coat, the same motions that had seen him through countless years of military service. A quick inspection of his rifle, the cartridges neatly aligned on the wooden table, preceded his exit into the biting cold. The frigid air seared his lungs with each inhalation, yet it wasn't merely the weather that stirred his apprehension. It was the unwavering conviction that the men who had left those telltale tracks in the snow would inevitably return. Some might wonder why he hadn't simply ridden into town to seek assistance, or at least alert the marshal to the impending danger. The truth, however, was starkly straightforward. Michael harbored a deep-seated distrust of the town's so-called law enforcement when it came to matters of this nature. He had witnessed far too many instances of men conveniently turning a blind eye when their personal gain or ingrained prejudices were at stake. He knew that if strangers were to come seeking Naya, not a single soul in Grey Bluff would lift a finger to help. The entire burden of protecting her rested squarely on his shoulders. As he meticulously circled the perimeter of the cabin, his worst fears were confirmed. More tracks, this time clearer and more distinct, were freshly imprinted in the snow. 3 pairs of boots, perhaps even 4. They had cautiously kept to the edge of the tree line, moving with calculated silence, testing the ground near his property. His jaw clenched tightly as he followed their trail until it disappeared deeper into the dense woods. Whoever these men were, they possessed enough cunning not to act hastily or recklessly. They were patiently waiting, carefully observing, biding their time. Inside the rustic cabin, Nia sat quietly by the crackling fire, her nimble fingers once again engaged in stitching. She immediately looked up as he entered, her gaze meeting his with unwavering intensity. She seemed to decipher the answer etched on his face, even before he uttered a single word. "They're close," Michael stated, matter-of-factly, as he carefully hung his rifle on the back of a nearby chair. Her hands momentarily stilled in her lap. How many? 3, maybe more. Hard to tell precisely in the snow. A flicker of fear crossed her delicate features, but she steadfastly refused to avert her gaze. "These men, they take women before they trade them." The unspoken words hung heavily in the air, filling the small space with a palpable sense of dread. Those who had been following this unfolding narrative from the very beginning might have questioned why such ruthless men would venture so far into the unforgiving wilderness. Why would they risk facing the treacherous snow and bitter cold simply to pursue her? Michael saw the answer reflected in the depths of her eyes. Once she had managed to escape their clutches, they would relentlessly pursue her until they had exhausted every possible avenue. To them, she was nothing more than a valuable prize, not a person worthy of basic human dignity. Michael crossed the room with deliberate strides, kneeling beside the stove to tend to the glowing coals. His voice, though calm, held an undercurrent of steel. "If they come, we'll hold them right here. They won't ever take you back." Nia's lips trembled almost imperceptibly, but she straightened her shoulders with newfound resolve. "Then teach me." And so he did. He patiently showed her how to properly reload the rifle, how to meticulously check the chamber, and how to brace her body firmly against the wall for added stability when aiming. At first, her hands shook uncontrollably, but her eyes remained sharp and intensely focused. He gently corrected her stance with a light touch to her elbow, subtly steadying her grip on the weapon. "Don't fight the kick," he instructed. "Let it move through you." She nodded silently, biting down on her breath to suppress any outward signs of fear, meticulously repeating each step until her movements gradually became more fluid and confident. For Michael, the entire experience felt profoundly surreal. He had trained countless men in the art of combat before, but never someone quite like her. Yet, within her unwavering determination, he recognized the same indomitable spirit that resided within himself. The hours that followed seemed to stretch on endlessly. They diligently worked together, ate sparingly, and remained constantly vigilant, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Each unfamiliar sound from the outside, each sharp crack of ice, each caw of a crow overhead, sent Michael's nerves spiraling further on edge. He consciously forced himself to remain calm and composed for her sake, but deep down, every primal instinct screamed that the impending fight was drawing near. As dusk settled, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple, he heard it. The unmistakable crunch of boots on the crisp snow, closer than ever before. He rose swiftly from his chair, rifle firmly in hand, and silently motioned for Nia to stay low. The knock came suddenly, a hard and demanding rap against the solid wooden door. "Open up!" a gruff voice barked, rough and commanding. "We know she's in there." Michael's grip tightened on the rifle. He kept his voice steady and even. "You've got the wrong place." A harsh laugh echoed from outside. "Don't play dumb, cowboy. We saw her tracks. She's ours. Best step aside before you get hurt." Nia's hand instinctively clutched Michael's arm. He glanced down at her, seeing the unmistakable fear reflected in her eyes, but also a spark of defiance. She whispered urgently, "Don't let them take me." Michael turned back to face the door, his resolve unwavering. His answer was firm and resolute. "You'll have to kill me first." A tense silence descended, followed by the sound of boots scraping across the snow. The walls of the cabin seemed to press in tighter, amplifying the sense of impending doom. Michael knew with absolute certainty that they would not simply walk away. Men of that nature didn't give up so easily when their prey was within reach. He quickly motioned for Nia to move behind the bed, urging her to stay low and out of sight. She obeyed without hesitation, clutching the rifle he had loaded for her. The first shot rang out, cracking through the wooden window shutter, sending splinters of wood flying through the air. Michael dropped to the floor, returning fire through the gaping hole in the wood. A cry of pain erupted from outside. The fight had officially begun. For the next several minutes, the cabin shook violently with the deafening sounds of gunfire, the sharp echoes reverberating across the valley. Michael moved with unwavering precision, each shot carefully measured, each breath deliberately controlled. Nia remained low to the ground, alert and ready, her eyes wide with fear, but ultimately unflinching. She was no longer the helpless victim he had rescued from the creek. She was here, fighting for her very right to live free. As the intensity of the shooting gradually subsided, an eerie silence stretched out, thick and heavy. Michael pressed his back against the wall, straining to listen for any sign of movement. Then he heard it, the distinct crunch of retreating boots, the sound of men pulling back into the trees. He didn't immediately give chase, not yet. He held his ground, waiting patiently until the sounds faded into the distance. Finally, he slowly lowered the rifle. His hands trembled faintly, though his face remained composed and expressionless. Nia crawled out from behind the bed, her chest heaving rapidly, her eyes locked on his. "They'll come again," she stated, her voice raw, but filled with conviction. Michael nodded in agreement. "And we'll be ready." As the warm light from the fire flickered across their faces, the unspoken bond between them seemed to solidify, growing stronger with each passing moment. The unanswered questions of why he had risked his life to save her, why she had chosen to stay, and what their place in this vast and unforgiving land would ultimately be, all of it sharpened into one undeniable truth. They were no longer merely two strangers bound together by chance. They were now partners in survival, and whatever challenges lay beyond that door would have to break both of them completely in order to succeed. That night, as snow continued to fall softly and the cabin settled into a tense and uneasy silence, Michael maintained a watchful vigil by the fire, rifle always within reach. Nia sat silently beside him, no longer distant or withdrawn, no longer plagued by doubts. They had faced the first storm together, and there was absolutely no turning back. The night following the intense gunfire was the longest that Michael Boone had experienced since his days in the war. He remained seated in his chair beside the stove, his rifle resting across his lap, his ears keenly attuned to every subtle sound emanating from the darkness outside. The air within the cabin carried the lingering scent of gunpowder and smoke, a stark reminder of the bullet that had pierced through the shutter. Nia stayed close, wrapped tightly in a quilt, but steadfastly refusing to lie down and rest. She asked no further questions, simply kept her gaze fixed intently on the door, her entire body tensed, as if she might spring into action at any moment to defend the cabin if necessary. At dawn, the world outside was eerily still. The fresh snow shone brilliantly, covered with a thin, icy crust. The branches of the trees drooped heavily under the weight of the accumulated snow, adding to the pervasive sense of silence. Michael cautiously stepped outside, his rifle raised, carefully scanning the surrounding area. What he discovered confirmed his suspicions. Bloodstains marred the pristine snow, and drag marks led directly toward the dense timber. At least one of the men had been wounded, and all of them had retreated back into the woods under the cover of darkness. However, they hadn't abandoned the valley entirely. They were simply biding their time, waiting for another opportunity to strike. Inside the cabin, Nia rose to her feet as he returned, her face searching his for answers. He spoke before she could even voice her concerns. "They'll be back. Men like that don't quit. Not when they believe something is rightfully theirs to take." Her jaw tightened visibly, but she didn't avert her gaze. "Then we end them." Michael studied her intently, absorbing the weight of her words, spoken with quiet but absolute certainty. He knew that some might question why he didn't simply pack her onto a horse and ride away, disappearing into the vast expanse of the territory. Why had he chosen to stand and fight rather than vanish without a trace? The truth was remarkably straightforward. Running would only serve to invite further pursuit, prolonging the inevitable. Standing his ground and fighting back was the only way to truly put an end to it. And beyond that, this was his home. He had painstakingly built it with his own 2 hands after burying his beloved wife. Each plank and nail had been deliberately driven to keep his mind from completely shattering. He would not abandon it, and he would not abandon her. They spent the entire day preparing for the inevitable return of their attackers. Michael showed her how to properly load the revolver he kept hidden beneath a wooden trunk, how to steady her hand, and how to fire only as a last resort when she had absolutely no other choice. They carefully inspected the cabin's vulnerable points, reinforcing the lower shutter with stacks of firewood and strategically placing spare ammunition within easy reach. For the first time, they worked together as equals, not as caretaker and survivor, but as true partners. As evening approached, the men returned as expected. Michael heard them before he saw them. The distinct crunch of boots on the snow, the low but menacing murmur of voices circling the cabin like predators closing in on their prey. He silently motioned for Nia to remain near the stove with the revolver. Then he cautiously opened the door, rifle raised, stepping out into the frigid air. 3 men stood in the yard, their rifles slung over their shoulders and pistols drawn. Their faces were rough and weathered, their beards coated with ice, their eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger. One of them sneered, pointing toward the cabin. "Hand her over, cowboy. She's worth more than this shack." "You keep her. You die with her." Michael's jaw clenched tightly. He leveled his rifle without hesitation. "She's not yours to claim." The man spat contemptuously into the snow. "You think she chose you? She's nothing but trade stock. Step aside." Before Michael could respond, Nia's voice cut through the tense atmosphere from the doorway. "I am not stock." She stood framed by the warm firelight behind her, her slender figure partially concealed by his shirt and coat, the revolver held steadily in her hands. Her voice was strong and clear, carrying easily across the snow-covered ground. "You will not take me." The men hesitated, momentarily taken aback by her unexpected display of defiance. Michael seized the opportunity. His rifle cracked loudly, dropping the first man where he stood. The others fired back in response, bullets thudding against the cabin wall, sending plumes of snow spraying into the air. Nia fired once, the sound sharp and distinct, and another man fell to the ground, clutching his shoulder and crying out in pain as he collapsed into the snow. The last remaining attacker turned and fled in terror toward the tree line. Michael slowly lowered his rifle, his breath clouding heavily in the frigid air. The yard was still once again, but it was no longer empty. 2 men lay motionless in the snow, and the third had vanished into the woods. He turned to face Nia. She stood tall in the doorway, the revolver still firmly in her grasp, her chest heaving. Her eyes met his, not with fear, but with unwavering certainty. "It's done," Michael said, his voice rough but steady. "They won't come again." He knew that there might be whispers in town later, tales of gunfire heard, bodies found, but it no longer mattered. What truly mattered was that the immediate threat had been eliminated. That night, as snow fell softly across the valley, Michael and Nia sat together by the crackling fire. The rifles were set aside, the shutters were mended, and the cabin stood strong and resilient. She leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder, the quilt wrapped snugly around them both. "You could have left me," she said quietly. "I could have," Michael admitted. "But I didn't, and I won't." Her hand reached for his, her fingers curling tightly around his. For a long moment, the silence that stretched between them conveyed far more than words ever could. Gratitude, trust, and the glimmer of something new that neither had dared to hope for. Michael thought of his wife's grave beneath the old cottonwood tree, of the long years he had spent living in silence and routine. For the first time since that tragic day, the crushing weight on his chest began to ease. He hadn't simply replaced what was lost. He had consciously chosen to build something entirely new. As the firelight flickered across their faces, Nia whispered softly, "Then I stay." Michael pulled her closer, kissing her gently, not with desperation, but with the calm assurance of a man who had finally stopped running from his own personal demons. Outside, the storm had passed. Inside, the cabin was no longer just one man's refuge. It was now a shared home, a place claimed by choice. The story ended there, with no questions left unanswered, no doubts lingering. She was no longer alone, and neither was he. They had faced death together, and what remained was life, quiet, steady, and theirs to keep.